So what rewards and what punishments can the speaker dole out to enforce these rules? Because they're not, I'm assuming they're not legally binding, right? They're only binding insofar as there's a reward or threat associated with following them. So what are the rewards and the punishments that are brought out for following or violating these rules?
I mean, a lot of the time most people draw attention to the career punishments, right? So if you don't toe the party line, you're not going to get that Ways and Means assignment that you were really looking for, right? If you don't toe the party line, you're not going to be in line for that energy and commerce position. If you don't toe the party line, you're not going to get that subcommittee chair that you're looking for, right? If you don't toe the party line, you won't elevate to a full committee chair. And those are good, but those are kind of like limited to a certain group of people. Most members aren't in Congress long enough to get any of those positions anyway, right? I think the much more devastating type of punishments come in the form of electoral politics or legislative goods. So, for example, if you don't toe the party line, like we will drop resources from your re-election campaign. We will eliminate your ability to get good staff on the campaign trail. Or from a policy perspective, it's like, hey, that bill that we were going to bring up on suspension next week, you didn't vote with us on this particular bill, that's gone. Right. And I've heard of that. I've had a friend of mine who was working on a bill with a colleague. They had a bipartisan coalition. Somebody had co-sponsored their bill. It was signed up. It was ready to go onto the floor. And then all of a sudden it just disappeared. And she was like, what happened to the bill? Like it was on the agenda. Like it was going to be brought up on Tuesday. Like I saw it on the vote thing. Like, where did it go? And they found out from the member that they had co-sponsored with that, this member had voted the wrong way on a particular procedural vote. And that cost them the bill that they were going to pass. So the leadership just took their bill right off the agenda. And that's indicative of all that stuff. You want an earmark? Well, you're going to have to play ball, right? You're going to have to, if you want that, that bridge fixed, right? Or if you want that port dredged, like the provisions and languages that go into bills. I mean, the leaders can really dole out a lot of really heavy consequences from both bills to policy language and substance. That can be pretty devastating for a member, right? This is your top 5 legislative priorities. Those won't happen this year. So it's multifaceted, right? And those are some of the punishments. And likewise, the rewards are like, hey, if you support us on this, we can give you these other things, or we can help you facilitate that bill you were working on, or maybe we can fast track this thing that you've been working on, or I know you've been thinking about that NDAA provision, maybe we can get that in there. There's a lot of sort of legislative negotiations that go on in that way. It's really kind of the substance of the institution, but it's also where that leverage that leaders have comes from. When you have power to control the agenda and what's in all the bills, like you're able to do a lot of things.
And so it seems to me this concentration of power in the speaker and in the rules is not something that you think is an ideal state for Congress. Where do you think it should go, or where do you think is an optimal kind of situation when it comes to the power of the speaker versus the individual member or the committee head?
Yeah, well, I say kind of like a shifting scale, right? I think right now it's become so exacerbated that there are some negative consequences associated with it. Members don't have freedom to go to the floor to affect the agenda in any substantive way, which means that the legislative agenda is primarily filled with partisan-like and party priority type situations, whether that's a messaging bill or something that clarifies the positions of the two parties, right? Francis Lee and Jim Curry have done some excellent work on that, where a lot of the things that Congress does now are just content clarifying representation, right? So how are we different than the other party? Not laws, just how are we different from them? And I think that has some consequences for it, right? Social consequences, it has political consequences. And I think we've gotten to a point where this type of process is sort of like outlasted its use. Now, where it came from, it's pretty obvious why these changes were made. The 1970s Democratic Party, who had been in control of Congress for 20 some odd years at that point in time, couldn't pass bills that really wanted to pass because committee chairs were just stubborn and wouldn't let them. So it makes sense that they were reformed and then you gave more power to the party leadership. But anytime you give power to a particular institution in Congress, that institution tends to accrue power over time. And we got to a point where the speakership is a dramatically different figure even than it was when it was given these authorities in 1975 and 1977. So it's been able to centralize power and control the institution in a way that's really beyond what was intended, because the institution has carried it and kind of reinforced its power in various ways. So yeah, I think now we've got to get to a situation where we talk about enabling different voices to direct the congressional agenda. And for me, that's, I think we're likely in line for some kind of committee reforms, right? And by committee reforms, I don't really mean committee reforms. I mean disempowering the speaker, right? Kind of weakening the speakership and weakening their control of the institution. Because it's not going to change until you do that, right? Until you're not going to get different voices manifest in the institution or in Congress and on the floor without sort of taking power away from that particular leader. So I think that given a current system, I would prefer to see something that was a little bit more robust in terms of the committee process. But that means disempowering the speaker.
And obviously what we've been talking about is really focused on the House. What about on the Senate side, where a lot of people think it's maybe the opposite problem, where everyone has a veto and there's no central guiding principles or majority rule. What is your thought about what's happening in the Senate over time?
Well, the Senate's an interesting thing, right? Everybody has a veto, yet majority leaders are also the most powerful that they've ever been over there too, right? So there's this very sort of like weird paradox where everybody can stop something and the majority leader controls everything that's stopped, right? And what moves forward. So I do think that the filibuster has sort of outlasted its function. It used to be something that, wasn't used to the degree that it is now. And there was an argument at one point in time that you could make, like, yes, it can facilitate more bipartisan cooperation because you're forced to get 60 votes. But when it's used uniformly on everything all the way across the board, and it turns the Senate into essentially a supermajority institution because you have to get a filibuster, or you have to get cloture on every single amendment, every single bill, and it's got to get 60 votes. Well, then you've created an institution that's very, very different than what even the framers were considered, right, when they created the Senate. And so I do think that the Senate probably needs to have some sort of filibuster reform to enable those processes and enable the majority to be able to pass things, right, and be able to hold up some kind of democratic accountability to the institution. At the same time, like, that's not going to solve all the problems, right, and that's not going to weaken majority leaders. In fact, it may actually strengthen them over time, because all of a sudden you're giving them the power to structure the process even more, and not just structure like what we're going to vote on cloture, but structure like what will be passed. So there's the potential that majority leader becomes even more powerful, and you need a totally different set of reforms that would enable different voices to be heard. But the Senate is a different institution. It's more flat. And until we get rid of the filibuster, this is all sort of like, we don't know what's going to happen with that sort of that reform. And I guess empowering the committees in the Senate is going to have to require a different set of rules changes as well. But the only thing anybody's talking about is making the place a little bit more partisan heavy. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic, to be honest.
And in terms of the Senate, the committees, in a sense, you might think they're not as strong since any individual senator can kind of get involved in any particular issue. How do you see the concept of the committee in the Senate? How does it evolve and differently than the House, I should say?
Well, that's an interesting thing because committees, like you said, have never been the sort of like organs of legislating that they have been in the House. The House is much more unwieldy. It's much larger. And because of that, they've had to rely on structures and rules to sort of govern its process more. The Senate is plenty big now, right? That's changed pretty dramatically. But committees still haven't had the same sort of influence that they have on overall negotiations because the filibuster, which has typically empowered legislators to have a positive effect on legislating. That positive effect is largely gone now, right? Because the filibuster is used in such a negative way that it actually prevents anybody from introducing anything new, and more often just forces majority leaders to invoke cloture on things that'll either become law or die right there on the spot. So in the Senate, I think if you got rid of the filibuster, you would see a situation where committees might be more powerful, simply because what you've done is disempowered individual senators. without the ability to filibuster, senators would become pretty weak, relatively speaking. You're taking power away from yourself in order to empower a majority. And when you do that, you're empowering a collective over the individual. So it would be interesting to see what would happen in a post-nuclear Senate where you have a majority process. You can imagine that committees might be more influential because all of a sudden legislating and doing those things would be easier, fewer vetoes would be in place. And so gatekeeping would sort of go from the individual to the collective level where you're talking about committees as larger, more important gatekeepers than they already are. And of course, the party leader becomes an important gatekeeper as well because of the types of privileges that they have accrued since 1937. But you could see them getting more powerful in a place where there's no filibuster, because all of a sudden, when you weaken individuals, something's going to emerge in that spot. It's going to be the two major organizing structures, those committees and parties.
Yeah, it seems illogical for any individual senator to give up the filibuster unless there's an overwhelming cost associated with it from the party, right? So, it's curious that we're at a position now where the party is so strong that there's talk of giving up the filibuster. That would imply that the party has reached a level of power that it never has in the past.
Yeah, well, it would be true too, right? Typically, and in my personal opinion, it would take something really egregious for senators to agree to nuke the filibuster. There's this hunch out there that people are like, oh, well, we're one vote away, and if Joe Manchin tips, then the whole cascade goes down. I don't think we're actually that close. Outside of something like truly egregious, like complete blockade on like government funding on appropriations, for example, like on a CR even. I think that short of that, right? I don't think that we're going to see the kind of unity among any majority that's capable of saying like, you don't have this power anymore, right? This power to filibuster is what makes being a senator so cool, right? You can go over there, you can just kill stuff. And you can't do that as a House member. You can't kill stuff. And that may seem sort of like childish, but like there's a huge difference, right? And you can get all sorts of things when you have the filibuster in your back pocket. Now, the problem is it's being used so much that it's lost its value, right? It's sort of like there's an inflation problem with filibustering over there. And so it has lost its value, it's lost its cachet. And so the willingness of any individual to keep the filibuster is probably diminished greatly because it's no longer the very cool thing that it once was. It's only like kind of cool, and like you only can use it in some circumstances where it's actually effective, or you can make a positive change out of a negative agenda power. And so I do think that outside of something egregious, we are going to continue this sort of charade, at least for a few more years. But that said, like the momentum is clearly on one side. I do think the filibuster is probably on its last legs. I just don't think it's going to be in this Congress necessarily.
Right. Well, let's move on to what we call our lightning round, where we ask the same questions of all of our guests so that someday we can compare the answers. Are you ready for the next phase?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. Well, the first question is around what do you think congressional representation should mean?
I think congressional representation should mean something more diverse than what it currently means, right? A process that's capable of reflecting the diversity of opinions out there. I think there's all this talk about polarization and partisanship. It glosses over the huge amount of economic, demographic, and ethnic diversity that's out in the public. And when you don't have those voices being heard, when everything's kind of shoved into a Democratic or Republican box before it's produced out of a chamber, what you're doing is you're losing a lot of the representational value of Congress, right? Congress is meant to be this sounding board. It's meant to give multiple members like their opportunity to bring something to the floor and to contribute meaningfully to the deliberation of legislation. So I think that that's the case in terms of the institutions, processes that enable different ideological debates and different ideological coalitions to kind of force itself on the agenda. And electorally, I would like to see greater demographic diversity, right? Whether that's religious, ethnic, gender, professional, right? There's a lot of lawyers in Congress, right? There are other people in the American public that have something to say about that. So I think a lot of congressional representation should be on reflecting the diverse nature of the United States, because it is a very, very, very diverse place, geographically, economically, and everything else in between. And I would like to see it mean more that each one of these voices could have a say in what Congress discusses.
So it sounds like, from an individual member point of view, a member in your mind should reflect his whole district or state, rather than a minority within it that is in line with his party in particular or his voter base. It sounds like the representative should represent everyone in their district. Is that right?
Well, I think that not necessarily. I think that these two things go hand in hand, and it's not one or the other, right? So you have a lot of Republicans in Montana, for example. Those are very different Republicans than the Republicans you find in Florida, right? Why? Because Florida has different geography, has different weather, it has different history, right? It has different culture. Like there's just a ton different. Like you do different things in Florida than you do in Montana, not only economically, but just like in general, socially even. And the fact that you have very, very different places represented by Republicans does not mean that there's no difference between those two. I just think that those are glossed over to a degree that we sort of lose a lot of representational value. Like maybe like some regional interest or ideologies should be able to have their time on the floor, as well as like some Southern or some Northeastern or some Western or something along those lines. Breaking down party doesn't necessarily mean like, representing an entire constituency or not. It just means allowing the diversity of opinions within a particular caucus to flourish, and allow some like the geographic, economic, etc. diversity that we see among the members to come about and force the congressional agenda to push something different.
And what about the concept of representation of the beliefs versus the interests of a constituency? So, obviously to take your Montana example, the member could reflect exactly what those in Montana think about a particular bill, or they could make their own judgment on that bill and what they think is in Montana's best interest for the long term. Where do you fall on that spectrum?
I've seen it be effective either way, right? You have people who are delegates and sort of like, yes, I'm more liberal than my district, or yes, I'm more conservative than my district, but this is what's best, right, for my district. I've also seen people like toe the party line, be like, I go either way. It just depends on what the district interest is. And so I've seen it done well either way. I don't think that there's an ideal there necessarily. I think both the delegate and trustee models like fit, because both members have occupied Congress at the same time. So I think that they both are necessary in Congress, right? You need those ideological members as well as the pragmatists, right? I think they both have a role. And I don't think that necessarily like if we had all pragmatists that it would be somehow better than if we had all ideologues. I think they work well in concert, right? You have the people who like what can be done versus like what needs to be done. This is a meaningful debate that Congress should incorporate.
All right. Next question is, how would your ideal Congress allocate its time?
I'm not going to lie. I saw this question. I was not a huge fan of it because I think that it really does depend on the historical context. I will say today that I wish the current Congress did less fundraising. I wish it spent more time in committee rooms, both in terms of legislative functions, learning the policy areas, and doing oversight of executive agencies and the way that policy is being implemented. But that's relative to today's Congress. Past Congresses spent too much time in committee rooms, right? And arguably not enough time engaging in like partisan fights and distinguishing the two parties from itself. So I think it really does depend on the context. I'm not sure that I could create an ideal that is universal across all of these different things. Because, at different times, Congress does different things and reflects different eras and interests and challenges. And I think that's important to understand that sort of it changes with the times.
And what about in terms of in DC versus in the home district?
Yeah, this is an interesting question. I think that if they're in DC, I would like them to be focused on legislative stuff versus fundraising stuff. I think being in the district is a good thing and overall, and this is something that's changed dramatically over time, but the flexibility that we have now is good, right? I just don't know if there's an ideal between DC time and district time. I do think that time in DC should be spent on, I would say that I would like to see them holding leaders more accountable to what happens in DC versus sort of just enabling them to go and negotiate with whatever they want. I think time spent in session is an overused term, because it really does depend on like, well, how effective were they at managing those session days versus how much time do they spend in the district. I think both are necessary things, but I think that the way that time is allocated has maybe skewed a little bit.
All right, next question is, how should debate, deliberation, or dialogue occur or be structured in Congress?
Well, again, going back to what we've been talking about, I'd like to see more voices incorporated. I think it's too controlled at the current moment. There's not enough diversity of opinion within the legislative process. I think that parties are managing it the best that they can, and they're doing a good job managing it in the ways that they know how to. But I think it pushes control and debate into a familiar grinder that produces a familiar product. And I think that, maybe less content clarifying representational issues would be not such a terrible thing. So empowering committees, empowering individuals, I think is a good idea. I have some less popular opinions, like kind of closing down transparency a little bit, like, getting rid of electronic votes in committee of the whole. Like you don't need to know how your member voted on every single issue, right? Making votes still there, but not electronic, I think would both speed up the process and maybe enable decision-making at that level. Opening space for like live deliberation, as opposed to, which entails like closing some windows of transparency to a degree, like, enabling members to sort of like speak to each other by first names and rolling up their sleeves and having a legitimate negotiation within the chambers and the places that they do policy making is an important thing that that is often, it's a little bit unpopular of an opinion, but I think it's still necessary, because having so much transparency often means that those negotiations over important policy issues just go somewhere else, as opposed to being present and being done in front of the entire membership.
Yeah, that's a possibility, that where there's transparency, the power will move away towards a place where there's less transparency.
That's right.
So it sounds like you support more of the discussion within a committee and have a lot of those opinions and dialogue happening in committee, and then creating a little bit less transparency, or less transparency into individual votes in order to preserve a kind of autonomy for the members. Is that right?
Well, I think it's something like that. I think empowering committees enables individual members, right? The processes are more free flowing in committee. Committees, when they are in control of the agenda, typically means that you're incorporating more decision makers into the agenda setting process, which I think is important. So it's a structure and a type of process that I think is more inclusive, generally speaking. And I also think that, if you kind of close some of these spaces a little bit, that having real negotiations over policy with the entire membership of the committee present is a better alternative than like a committee chair and the speaker going into a room and deciding what happens. I think that, being able to close spaces and make raw deliberation available to members would enable them to enable more members to be incorporated in that decision-making structure and process. Whereas today, like, you open committee hearings, which just means like no real deliberation is happening. It's all position taking and sort of, for the cameras, and all the real decisions have just been pushed to a different room that's typically smaller and includes fewer people.
All right, next question is, what fundamental institutional improvement should Congress make within 50 years? And it sounds like it's leadership. Your answer is going to be devolve some power from leadership to the committees. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, we'll just take power away from the leadership, generally speaking, right? You don't need to empower the committees necessarily. They already got plenty of power. You just got to like remove some of the controls that are in place that enable the party leaders to exert so much control over what happens. So I would do that. Committee assignments, floor processes, I think that those could be reformed in a way that would enable a more inclusive process, or at least one that's less beholden to the parties, which would facilitate a little bit more representational diversity, at least in my opinion.
And do you have any, procedural magic bullets for the institution?
No magic bullets, but I would certainly limit change the way the Rules Committee is populated and assigned. I would probably change the way that committee assignments are assigned. I would make that more of a rolling process, or some sort of committee on committees that evolves over time. There have been some interesting proposals that have been done on the Rules Committee. There was a member that proposed that the Rules Committee should be only majority members. So they're the only majority members are making the decisions, but that the speaker didn't have control over it, and it was like a term limited type committee. So basically you have 15 majority members who are going to negotiate amongst themselves what bills are going to come to the floor. I think that brings some interesting politics. Maybe it doesn't change anything, but it's been something that I've been, ever since I heard it, I'm like, oh, that's kind of interesting. It's a different look at the way that the institution functions. It'd be a huge change. But it might free up some of that. It might loosen some of those controls.
All right, next one is what book or article most shaped your thinking with respect to congressional reform?
Well, I can't name a single book or article. I can name some authors, though. Theoretically speaking, Larry Dodd was big in terms of like understanding how to think about institutions and historical perspective. Adam Steingate and Randall Strahan have been huge in terms of, for me, in terms of understanding how institutions are, how they function, how leaders function within them, and how they use the rules to their advantage. And I think those are all amazing theoretical authors. Institutionally, I've been heavily influenced by like Stephen Smith, Jason Roberts, Barbara Sinclair, Tony Madonna, Francis Lee, and Jim Curry. They do some really, really fascinating work on how the rules structure deliberation and how party politics and processes and institutions shape outcomes in Congress and deliberation in Congress. So those are lots of authors there, but those are all the heavy influences on me.
Great. And the last question is about your future. Where do you see your research going over the long term? What are your plans?
It's not going to be too different. The short-term goal is to finish the book, and the long-term goal is also to finish the book. So I'm currently in the process of wrapping.
So just tell us the book. What's the book about? And
right. So the book is about the cycles of legislative reform and congressional reform in the House since 1879. So why did speakers become so powerful? Why did they lose power? Why did they get power again? And why are they powerful again? It's basically the kind of cycle of procedural change that I'm explaining, and then how power develops between those big major reforms. Like when there's no major changes to the rules, how is power changing? So the book is a long look at like the three eras of lawmaking since 1879, and how it's changed and why it's changed the way it did.
Great. Well, looking forward to it. And Josh, thanks so much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Matt. It's a pleasure.